Last time we talked about the idea that all human action starts with a gap, and that we define success as the ability to cross a gap, to go from a situation that we have to a situation we want. And I propose that for pervasive gaps, gaps that we get stuck in, that the source of sustained change is at the level of being. Our values, our habits, our sort of ways of thinking. Sometimes we call it our mental models. And I want to go further this time and talk about how do we cross these things. We know that we have to somehow deal with this level of being or the way we think, but what's actually the steps for crossing a gap? Now, we've been doing this as human beings for a long time, and over the centuries, we've captured sort of methods and ways of doing this through stories. And a guy that spent his career studying this sort of thing is Joseph Campbell. Now, Campbell was a professor at USC, and he was a professor of anthropology. And he spent his entire career going around the world studying the myths and legends of various cultures. And he found in doing this that there were only a few archetypal stories that showed up or showed up over and over again in almost every different culture that he studied. And one of these archetypal stories was what he called the hero's journey. And this is really a story of how do you face and overcome a challenge. And I think there's a lot we can learn from this as we look at how we cross gaps. And now I want to introduce this as a version of Campbell's hero's journey. The book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, is where he captures this. If you're really into anthropology and are ready for a heavy and dense book, I recommend it. Otherwise, look at some of his more accessible works, for example, Myths to Live By. And again, I'm going to show this in an adaptation of Campbell's work. There's a lot more to his model, but I'm trying to pare it down to what I think is useful for our purposes. So Campbell sees this thing as a cycle. And I want to walk through the cycle, and there's sort of a predictable set of events that happens as we become aware of challenges, face those challenges, overcome them, and sort of right them in the world. And there are certain traps that happen along the way. There are certain events or places that our hero gets stuck. In the general cycle, there are two worlds. There's this world that's the external world of what I'm calling having and knowing. This is results and actions. And there's an internal world of knowing and being. This is the internal, of know-how, of values, beliefs, etc. Right? Now, the first stage in the journey is called apparent stability. If you think about it, many stories start once upon a time and they sort of lay the groundwork. I'd like to actually use the Star Wars films because everyone seems to know the story as a way to do this. And there's another reason why these stories are particularly useful for this. Campbell had a student, an aspiring filmmaker, when he was teaching at USC. And George Lucas actually built the Star Wars saga very explicitly on the hero's journey. As a matter of fact, there used to be at the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., an exhibit that showed the mapping of the Star Wars series to the hero's journey. And I'm going to actually use starting with Luke in episode 4 to give a sense of these different stages. So apparent stability is sort of when you think of once upon a time, right? Such and such was going on. In the case of Star Wars, you've got Luke living with his aunt and uncle on the moisture farm. He's been in this state for quite some time, and we say apparent stability because we know as the people outside viewing the story that it's not as stable as it seems. There's unseen forces going on. Now, there's a trap that the hero faces at the beginning of the journey in apparent stability, which I call the knower trap. And the knower trap is basically blindness caused by certainty. I mean, the idea is that the hero is in a place where they become blind to external data because they already know what the world's like. They know what the situation is. And in the stories, often this is represented by a couple things. It can be represented by some magical spell that keeps the hero from seeing the circumstances. Think of King Arthur. In terms of Merlin's sort of hidden him with a family, so he doesn't understand his true position in the world as the future king of England. Think of the Harry Potter stories, where again he's sort of separated and kept in the dark, right? Now, this being kept in the dark for me is sort of a metaphor, and that there's actually two sides to this idea of the knower trap, and two sides or two versions of blindness. On one side, and if you think about this as you apply it again more to our common situations, we have arrogance. The arrogance being that I already know how the world is, right? I don't have to pay attention to things because I know what the truth is, and my opinion is the truth. The way I see things is the way things are. And notice, you know, think about in your daily life, you know, there's times when you don't even see there's a problem. Think of leaders who are all of a sudden shocked by 360 feedback and discovering that people see them as micromanaging or see them as absent, for example. And anytime someone is shocked by the feedback, you get this, you're seeing the person being faced with the knower trap, right? They've been stuck in this blindness of certainty. Now the other extreme to this is deference, right? And deference is blindness caused by the acceptance of others' opinions as fact. In the sense, I know what's going on because others have told me, and I just blindly accept it. And this is what we see often in the stories, right? Luke has been given the story that his father was just a freighter pilot, and he's accepted these things blindly, even though he may have some inference that there's something more to this. So arrogance, you know, you can think of, for some reason Donald Trump comes to mind for me, right? It's sort of this hubris that I know everything, and I can't be bothered by other people's opinions. Deference, you know, if you remember, there was a movie called Yes Man with Jim Carrey, where he basically gives up his discernment. He decides he has to say yes to everything, and he gives up his own judgment. I think both of these are errors, and they're errors of being on the extreme. And all the traps that we'll look at for the heroes have to do with this sort of binary thinking. I get caught thinking that it's either this or this, and the way out of it is what I call the middle path. And the middle path is another one of these concepts that exists in basically all major world philosophies. The idea that in order to be successful, we have to integrate seeming extremes, right? Now, in this case, the healthy version of arrogance is confidence, right? We do know things. We do have opinions that are based on our experience and facts that we want to be able to hold. But we cross the line when confidence becomes arrogance, right? Confidence meaning I have confidence, I have faith in my own judgment and opinion, but I also remain open. The healthy form of deference is humility, the openness to others. But humility implies being open but still being able to discern, to use common sense and judgment. So for me, if you think about the middle path in this, I call it openness. And I think about being open with my opinion, but holding it as opinion, and opening to others, but not just blindly or recklessly open, right? And I think of Gandhi as an example of this. I often ask people, you know, do you think of Gandhi as lacking confidence? And most people say no. I mean, if you read the stories, he was very confident in his arguments and the way he stood up for things. And I also ask, do you see him as lacking humility? And actually, people think, well, no, he consistently listened, and he made a point of being close to people with different opinions and very open to different and very diverse opinions. So I think it's a good example of this integration of things that we think are opposite. In the sense, the trap is I either have to fight for my opinion and make other people accept it, or I have to just get rolled over, right? Where actually the middle path is integrating confidence and humility. And sometimes I think in order to remember this, I use the phrase seek truth, speak truth. In the sense of seeking truth is trying to understand the opinions of others, and even when they're given in ways that sort of are not as useful. And we'll go into the language of this in a moment. And speaking truth in the sense of really owning my opinions as opinions. Now, there's a lot of stories that sort of point out how this stuff happens. One of the most obvious for me is the story of Roger Bannister, who was the first person to run a sub 4-minute mile. Now, the year that he did this, there had been, I think it's something like 50 medical journals had said that a human being cannot run a sub 4-minute mile. They literally, the medical journals had said that the heart and lungs couldn't take the stress of it, and that people would actually potentially even die. Now, Bannister runs the 4-minute mile, and within 18 months, a lot of other people all of a sudden ran sub 4-minute miles. And this is a version of the knower trap, and this is in a way the deference piece of it. The runners took for granted, they took as truth others' opinions about what the human body could do, and it limited their performance because they weren't able to challenge it, right? Bannister somehow got out of the knower trap, in the sense became open to the possibility that he could do it. And when others were able to do it after him, the only thing that really changed was their ability to challenge the mental model, right? The only thing that changed was the belief that they could do it. And it shows you the power of the shifting of a mental model. Now, this shows up in business as well. A famous story is that Thomas Watson, the chairman of IBM, back in the early days of IBM in computing, made the statement, or is said to have made the statement, that there's only a world market for about 5 computers, because the idea was the mainframe, and why would anybody want one of these? And the implication, this is sort of the arrogance, right? The sort of the arrogant certainty. I know that this is going to be, there's only a market for 5 computers, so why should we put money into creating these microcomputers? And if you know the story, of course, when microcomputing came along, IBM got into big trouble because they were sure it was not going to work. And their actions were based on that surety, and they missed the boat. They had some very tough years before sort of making this back up. So this is an example of sort of the arrogance. An example of deference is the Korean airliner crashes. Malcolm Gladwell, in one of his books, talked about this in great depth, that there had been an unusual number of crashes for Korean airlines, and they're trying to understand what happened. And the initial assumptions were that there must be inferior equipment or training, right? So as they looked into it, however, they found out that wasn't the case. And as they looked further into it, the thing that they found out was that in the hierarchical nature of Korean culture, it's very difficult to challenge authority. And that in these situations of these crashes, that somebody else in the cockpit could see it was going to happen, but was unwilling to challenge the authority of the pilot. So in a sense, they're giving up what they know to someone else. So again, this is sort of blind following, and what I'm calling deference. Another example of this that I've heard about recently is that there was a study done in surgeries where there was a mistake in the procedure, literally amputating the wrong limb, doing the wrong procedure on a patient, and that in the cases that where this happened, they found that somebody in the room really could see that this was happening, but failed to call the surgeon on it because of the hierarchical nature of the operating team. You know, the surgeon is sort of God. You don't challenge them. And so again, this is an example of the danger of deference, which is blind following. It's a different form of certainty because it's accepting blindly the opinion of others. So I want to talk about this in language, and for me, language is really critical to this whole process of being able to solve gaps. Language shows sort of the mental models that we have, and language is also, in a way, though it's the way out of the traps, by identifying the language both that I use in my head, but also even that I speak. Now, the language of certainty has a certain flavor, and you'll sort of notice it right away. Statements like this: you're wrong. It won't work. This is a waste of time. Everyone knows that. You should, and even, that's a great idea. Now, there's something wrong, I would say, with all of these statements, in the sense that they're not truth. What they are, if you look at them, they're statements of opinion, but they're stated semantically in the language of truth. Notice when I say, you're wrong, that's stated as if it's a fact, and yet it's an opinion. right? This is a waste of time. It's an opinion. It's a subjective perspective of something, but it's stated as if it's a fact. Now remember, I'm talking about both internal ways of thinking, using this language inside my head, as well as it showing up in conversation. So the problem with these is that they tend to create defensiveness. Imagine a leader in a meeting and someone puts out an idea and the leader says it won't work. Think about the impact on that conversation. It won't work takes the truth off the table. And so you have people typically are going to go into a fight or flight mode. Either they're going to have to push back and say yes it will, or they can go into a deferent mode, right? And say, well, I just won't say anything. And this is going to tend to shut the conversation down, particularly again in a leadership situation where there's a sense of authority. People aren't going to challenge. Now if you're a leader, what you want is the best thinking of the people around you. So if you're using this language, you're less likely to get that. And often people, I put this last one, that's a great idea, what sometimes shocks people, say, well, as a leader, don't I want to encourage people? But again, notice the problem with this. When I say that's a great idea, I've now shut down anybody who doesn't think it's a great idea. So I'm potentially losing ideas in the room by holding an opinion as truth. So what do I do? So if these aren't useful ways to state these things, how do I say these things in this with a spirit of openness as opposed to a spirit of certainty? Well, here's some examples. And by the way, there's many examples, I'm choosing just a few. So instead of you're wrong, I can say I see it differently. Notice I'm owning my opinion. Now, for me, this is no less confident, but it is much less arrogant. So in a way, it integrates the confidence. I'm giving my perspective, I see it differently, and it has the humility of saying, just because I see it differently doesn't mean that there aren't other perspectives out there as well. And I see it differently begs the question of how. It actually spurs on new conversation. Rather than it won't work, I have concerns. Right? Again, notice that it starts with I'm owning my concerns as opposed to just a blanket statement that it won't work, and it begs the question, what are those concerns? It encourages further conversation. Instead of this is a waste of time, I'm not finding value in this. I'm not saying there's not value in it. I'm not finding value from my perspective. And it doesn't stop me if I'm the leader and I want to shift where the meeting goes. It doesn't stop me from doing it. So by adopting the language where I remain open does not keep me from making decisions and moving the meeting on. It simply does it in a way where I'm not claiming that this is the only thing that must happen. I'm simply stating a preference. Now, I have the authority, if I'm running the meeting and I'm the leader, to move the meeting along. I can do it with confidence, or I can do it with arrogance. Arrogance saying, I'm moving this along because the rest of you are stupid, versus I'm moving it along because there's a choice point here about where we're going to spend our time. There's not a clear consensus, so as a leader, I'm going to make the call. Everyone knows that as one of those classic, right, when people are actually trying to hide their statements. It's a way to shut down people and keep them from challenging me. So what would I say? Well, I might say, this is my experience. And again, so I'm not saying my experience is insignificant. At the same time, by stating it as my experience, I'm acknowledging the idea that there may be other experience out there. We or you should. Should for me is an interesting word in English. It actually carries a lot of baggage. We use the word should around moral issues very often, right? You should respect your parents. You should be a good person. So we use it around ideas. We should adopt this strategy. It tends to carry that same sort of heaviness with it, and it tends to shut down discussion. And again, is it true that we should do it? I don't know. It's an opinion, but it's stated as a fact when we say we should. How else could we state it? Well, we can either propose or ask. So instead of saying we should do this, I propose that we or you do this, or I might make it a request if I really want to come to closure, and we'll talk about this idea of creating accountability later, but I can make a request that you do this. So that leaves the humility side of this, is that leaves it open to a response. The confidence side is that I'm making a confident request. Right? Now, that's a great idea. Again, it's problematic potentially because it suppresses disagreement. So how do I do that? I like that idea. So as a leader, that's a message that I share your idea, I like the idea, and it also leaves it open that other people may see it in a different way. So this is the knower trap. It's the first trap, and it starts right from the beginning. It's in the stories. This is where the hero is not able, because of their way of thinking, they're not able to see the gap even, right? They become blind to it. And bad things tend to happen, by the way, when the hero goes blind to the gap. And you think in the Star Wars case, right? Luke denies that there's that, when old Obi-Wan tells him the story of who he really is, and Luke kind of denies that he can do anything. He sort of refuses the call, which we'll come back to. But at that point, the stormtroopers kill his aunt and uncle, and very often the hero's hand is forced. But the knower trap, in the end, is this inability to see what's out there. And if you think about the practical application of this for yourself, is are you paying attention? Do you have assumptions about how the world works? Or think about situations where you're stuck in a relationship, or you're stuck on a project. Are you making assumptions about how it is or how it must be that keep you from seeing the true nature of the gap that's out there? So the next time we'll come back, we'll move along to the next stages and the next traps.